Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941. The Hawaiian sun was just beginning to warm the waters of Pearl Harbor when a strange sound filled the air, a high-pitched whine that grew louder and louder until it became a terrifying scream. American sailors looked up to see dark shapes plummeting from the sky, red circles blazing on their wings. These were the Aichi D3A dive bombers, and in the next few moments, they would change the course of history forever. The men standing on those decks had no idea they were witnessing the opening act of America's entry into the Second World War. The story of that morning actually begins years earlier, in 1936, in a Japanese aircraft design bureau where engineers were studying a German plane called the Heinkel He-70. The Imperial Japanese Navy needed a new dive bomber to replace their aging biplanes, and they wanted something that could operate from aircraft carriers. A challenging requirement that demanded a perfect balance of power, maneuverability, and structural strength. The designers at Aichi took inspiration from that German design, but made it distinctly their own. They created an all-metal, low-wing monoplane with fixed landing gear covered by distinctive spats, those teardrop-shaped covers that would become the plane's visual signature. When the prototype first flew in January 1938, it had problems. The early version, built by Nakajima with a 730 horsepower engine, was underpowered and had a nasty tendency to snap roll in tight turns. The dive brakes, copied from the German Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, vibrated so violently when the plane nosed over into its attack dive that they threatened to tear the aircraft apart. But the HI team didn't give up. They increased the engine power, first to 840 horsepower, then eventually to 1,000 horsepower with the Mitsubishi Kinsei engine. They enlarged the vertical stabilizer, reinforced those troublesome dive brakes, and added a distinctive dorsal fin that dramatically improved the plane's handling. What emerged was the D3A1, officially designated the Navy Type 99 carrier bomber Model 11. To its pilots, it was simply the Type 99. To the Americans who would face it in combat, it would become known by its code name, VAL. The VAL wasn't impressive on paper. It had a maximum speed of just 240 miles per hour, slower than most fighters of its day. Its armament was laughably light by military standards. Just two forward-firing 7.7 machine guns and one flexible gun in the rear cockpit for the radio operator. It could carry one 550-pound bomb under its fuselage or two smaller 132-pound bombs on the wings. But what made the VAL deadly wasn't raw power or heavy armament. It was the ability to put those bombs exactly where they needed to go. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized precision over volume. While American dive bombers would later rely on dropping multiple bombs and hoping for hits, Japanese pilots trained relentlessly to make every bomb count. They practiced diving at angles approaching 80 degrees, almost straight down, pulling out at the last possible moment to ensure accuracy. The VAL's exceptional maneuverability made these extreme diving attacks possible. Its low wing loading meant it could pull out of dives that would tear other aircraft apart. By late 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy had 129 D3A1s ready for their most ambitious operation yet. The plan had been years in the making, refined through war games and exercises. 6 aircraft carriers would sail in secret across the northern Pacific, maintaining radio silence to launch a surprise attack on the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The VAL dive bombers would play a crucial role, targeting the battleships and airfields in coordinated waves, designed to cripple American naval power in a single morning. The Japanese pilots selected for this mission weren't ordinary aviators. They were the elite of the Naval Air Service, many with combat experience from the war in China. They had practiced their attack runs countless times, studying models of Pearl Harbor until they could identify their targets with their eyes closed. Each pilot knew exactly which ship or facility he was supposed to hit. There was no room for error. They would have one chance to succeed. On the night of December 6th, 1941, the task force was in position, 230 miles north of Rahu. On the American side, it had been a typical Saturday evening. The alert status that had kept the base on edge for 2 weeks had been lifted that very day. Soldiers and sailors were enjoying their first real liberty in weeks. At Wheeler Field, pilots from the 19th Fighter Squadron were hosting friends. At Hickam Field, officers attended a party thrown by a wealthy Japanese banker, a detail that would seem sinister in retrospect. Dale Garno, a 25-year-old Navy officer, and his wife Johnny had been married just 4 months. That Saturday night, they stayed in their quarters near Pearl Harbor, debating whether to attend church in Honolulu the next morning. Wallace Martin, a pilot with the 19th Transport Squadron, had visited friends at Wheeler Field and returned home late, exhausted from 2 weeks of alert duty. Across the base, thousands of sailors slept in their bunks aboard the great battleships moored along Battleship Row, secure in the knowledge that they were thousands of miles from any war zone. At 6 a.m. on December 7th, the Japanese carriers turned into the wind. On their flight decks, 183 aircraft were warming up for the first attack wave. Among them were 51 Aichi D3A Val dive bombers, their crews making final checks of their equipment. The pilots synchronized their watches, confirmed their target assignments one last time, and climbed into their cockpits. At 6:15 a.m., the first plane roared down the carrier deck and into the grey dawn sky. The formation took shape as it headed south toward Oahu. High-level bombers, torpedo planes, fighters for escort, and the Vals climbing to their attack altitude. The dive bomber pilots could see the first light of dawn painting the ocean below them gold and blue. Many would later remember the beauty of that morning, the way the clouds parted to reveal the green mountains of Rahu ahead. It seemed impossible that they were about to start a war. At 7:02 a.m., two American radar operators at the Opana Point radar station picked up the incoming formation. It was the largest radar contact they had ever seen, so large that one operator thought the equipment was malfunctioning. They reported it to the information center at Fort Shafter, but the duty officer, thinking it might be a flight of B-17 bombers expected from California, told them not to worry about it. This was the first of several warnings that went unheeded that morning. At 7:33 a.m., another warning came from an unexpected source. The destroyer USS Ward reported attacking and possibly sinking a submarine outside Pearl Harbor. The message worked its way slowly up the chain of command, with officers debating whether it might be a false alarm. By the time anyone thought to connect the submarine report with the massive radar contact, it was too late. The first wave of Japanese aircraft crossed the Oahu coastline at 7:40 a.m. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, leading the attack, looked down at Pearl Harbor and could hardly believe their luck. The American fleet was exactly where they expected it to be, lined up in perfect rows. There was no smoke from ships getting up steam, no signs of anti-aircraft guns being manned. He transmitted the code words, Tora, 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 Tiger, 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 signaling that complete surprise had been achieved. Dale Garner was still in bed with his wife when the first explosions shook their quarters. Johnny thought a plane had crashed nearby. They rushed outside to find their neighbor, a Navy doctor, studying the sky through binoculars. Dale didn't need the binoculars. He could see the rising sun emblems on the aircraft wings with his naked eyes. "They are Japanese," he shouted, the words seeming impossible even as he spoke them. At Hickam Field, 3 airmen had just finished breakfast and were sitting on a bunk, talking casually. They heard an airplane flying low overhead, its engine unnaturally loud. "It looks like the Navy is practicing dive bombing again," one of them said. Seconds later, an explosion rocked the barracks. They ran outside just in time to see a bomb hit Hangar 7. The blast threw all three men off the stair landing and into a cactus plant. As they struggled to their feet, pulling thorns from their skin, they could see planes with red circles on their wings diving at impossible angles toward the flight line. The Val dive bombers assigned to Hickam Field came in high, then rolled into their attack dives. To the men on the ground, it seemed like the planes were falling out of the sky. The distinctive fixed landing gear made them look almost comical, like something from an earlier era of aviation. But there was nothing outdated about their bombing accuracy. The first Val to attack, Hickam, put its bomb directly through the roof of the main barracks. The explosion killed 35 men instantly. William Rudder, stationed at Hickam, watched as several brave soldiers tried to set up a machine gun on the parade ground to fight back. A Val spotted them immediately and dove. The plane came so low that Rudder could see the pilot's face, his goggles reflecting the morning sun. The machine gun crew was blown apart before they could fire a shot. Another crew rushed to take their place and met the same fate. The Japanese pilots were circling overhead, watching everything, directing their attacks with surgical precision. At Pearl Harbor itself, the Val dive bombers had even more spectacular targets. Battleship rows stretched before them, the pride of the Pacific Fleet lined up like sitting ducks. The USS Nevada, moored alone at the north end of the row, took the first hit from a Val's 550-pound bomb. The explosion tore through her deck, sending a column of smoke and flame into the sky. The sailors aboard these ships had been through countless drills, but nothing had prepared them for this. Seaman First Class George Frainer was brushing his teeth when the first bomb hit. He ran topside to see Val dive bombers screaming down at angles that seemed to defy physics. The planes would climb to about 10,000 feet, roll over, and plummet almost vertically toward their targets. At the last possible moment, sometimes as low as 500 feet, they would release their bombs and pull out of the dive, the G-forces causing the aircraft to groan audibly. The sound was unlike anything the Americans had heard before. The Vals had a distinctive siren-like wail as they dove, caused by the wind howling through their fixed landing gear and dive brakes. Combined with the scream of their engines at full throttle, it created a sound that survivors would describe as otherworldly, demonic, terrifying. One sailor said it was like all the demons of hell screaming at once. Carlos McQuiston of the 19th Transport Squadron had just walked outside when he saw aircraft circling over Pearl Harbor. At first, he attached no special significance to it. Military exercises were common. Then one plane banked sharply, revealing the red disk on its wing. The awful truth dawned on him in that instant. He watched as B-18 bombers on the flight line were systematically destroyed by strafing Vals. One brave gunner in a B-18 turret tried to fight back. McQuiston saw a Val dive directly at the man, its guns blazing. The turret exploded in a ball of fire. The precision of the Val attacks was devastating. Unlike level bombers that dropped their loads from high altitude and hoped for the best, the dive bombers could place their weapons with sniper-like accuracy. At Ford Island Naval Air Station, Vals destroyed nearly every aircraft on the ground in minutes. Their technique was methodical: dive, release, pull out, climb, and dive again. Some Vals made multiple attack runs, using their machine guns to strafe targets of opportunity after dropping their bombs. The second wave of the attack arrived at 8:50 a.m., including 78 more Val dive bombers. These faced more organized resistance. Anti-aircraft guns were now manned and firing, and a few American fighters had managed to get airborne. But the Vals pressed their attacks with suicidal determination. One dove directly through a curtain of anti-aircraft fire to put its bombs squarely on the destroyer USS Shaw. The explosion was so massive that it broke windows miles away. Lieutenant Commander Futchida, observing the attack from his high-level bomber, would later write about watching the Vals work. He described them as deadly artists, painting destruction with precise brushstrokes. Each dive was a calculated risk: too steep, and the pilot might not be able to pull out; too shallow, and the bomb would likely miss. The Val pilots had found the perfect balance, achieving hit rates that would have been impossible with any other method of attack. The human cost of this precision was staggering. On the USS Arizona, a Val's bomb penetrated the deck and detonated in the forward magazine. The explosion lifted the 31,000-ton battleship out of the water and broke her in half. In seconds, 1177 men were dead or dying. Survivors described seeing men blown overboard by the blast, their bodies on fire as they hit the water. The oil leaking from ruptured fuel tanks caught fire, turning the harbor into an inferno. The psychological impact of the Val attacks was almost as devastating as the physical damage. American sailors had never experienced dive bombing on this scale. The vertical attacks seemed to come from nowhere. One moment the sky was clear, the next a plane was screaming down directly at you. There was nowhere to hide on a ship's deck. Men who tried to run found that the Vals could adjust their aim during the dive, following moving targets with deadly precision. Radio man third-class Robert Coles was manning an anti-aircraft gun when a Val dove directly at his position. He could see the bomb detach from the plane's belly, could watch it growing larger as it fell toward him. Time seemed to slow down. He knew he should run, but his training kept him at his gun, firing until the last possible second. The bomb hit 20 feet away, the explosion throwing him across the deck. He survived, but would have nightmares about that falling bomb for the rest of his life. The Vals weren't just attacking ships. At Hickam Field, they systematically destroyed aircraft, hangars, and support facilities. One witness described watching a Val dive at such a steep angle that it seemed the pilot intended to crash into the ground. At the last moment, the plane pulled out, its bomb continuing on to destroy a maintenance shop. The pilot was so low that observers could see him looking back to confirm his hit. By 9:45 a.m., it was over. The last Val had dropped its bomb and turned north to return to the carriers. In less than 2 hours, they had helped cripple the Pacific Fleet. 8 battleships damaged or sunk, 3 cruisers damaged, 3 destroyers damaged or sunk, 188 aircraft destroyed, 2403 Americans killed. The Vals alone had accounted for a significant portion of this destruction, their precision bombing proving more effective than anyone had imagined possible. But the story of the Val didn't end at Pearl Harbor. It was just beginning. Over the next 6 months, these same dive bombers would terrorize Allied forces across the Pacific. In April 1942, Vals operating in the Indian Ocean achieved an even more impressive feat. Attacking the British Eastern Fleet, they placed more than 82% of their bombs on target. They sank the aircraft carrier HMS Hermes, the first carrier ever sunk by carrier-based aircraft. They sent the heavy cruisers Cornwall and Dorsetshire to the bottom in a matter of minutes. The secret to the Val's success wasn't just the aircraft, it was the men who flew them. Japanese naval aviators underwent training that was brutal even by military standards. Only the very best made it through. They practiced dive bombing until it became second nature, until they could put a bomb within a few meters of their target, even under combat conditions. Many of the pilots who attacked Pearl Harbor had hundreds of hours of combat experience from the war in China. But this expertise came at a cost. Japan's pilot training program was so selective and intensive that it couldn't produce replacements quickly enough. When experienced Val pilots were lost in combat, they couldn't be replaced with equally skilled aviators. This would become apparent at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, where American fighters slaughtered the slow, vulnerable Vals. The planes that had seemed invincible at Pearl Harbor were suddenly revealed to be sitting ducks when faced with determined fighter opposition. The Val's design philosophy reflected Japan's approach to the entire war: quality over quantity, precision over mass production. While American factories would eventually produce aircraft by the tens of thousands, Japan continued to rely on smaller numbers of supposedly superior machines flown by elite pilots. It was a strategy that worked brilliantly in the war's opening months, but proved unsustainable in a long conflict. By 1942, the Val was already becoming obsolete. Its fixed landing gear created drag that limited its speed. Its light armament made it vulnerable to enemy fighters. Its relatively short range limited its operational flexibility. The Japanese developed an improved version, the D3A2, with a more powerful 1,300 horsepower engine and increased fuel capacity. But even these improvements couldn't overcome the Val's fundamental limitations. The Americans, shocked by Pearl Harbor, learned quickly. They developed new tactics for dealing with dive bombers, improved their anti-aircraft defenses, and most importantly, produced new fighters like the F-6F Hellcat that could easily catch and destroy the slow-moving Vals. By 1943, VAL losses were mounting catastrophically. The elite pilots who had made the aircraft so deadly were dead, replaced by hastily trained rookies who lacked the skill to survive in increasingly hostile skies. The VAL story took a dark turn in the war's final phase. As Japan became desperate, many D3As were converted for kamikaze attacks. The aircraft that had once delivered bombs with surgical precision now became guided missiles, their pilots intending to die in the attack. It was a perversion of everything the VAL had been designed for, trading precision for desperation, skill for sacrifice. The emotional toll on both sides was immense. American sailors who had survived Pearl Harbor found themselves facing VALs again, but now flown by pilots who had no intention of returning. The psychological warfare aspect of the kamikaze attacks was almost as damaging as the physical destruction. Men who had learned to defend against conventional bombing now faced an enemy willing to turn himself into a bomb. Yet even in these suicide attacks, the VAL's inherent qualities shone through. Its stability and maneuverability made it an effective kamikaze platform. Its robust construction meant it could absorb significant damage and still reach its target. Several American ships were severely damaged or sunk by VAL kamikazes, though the loss rate for the attacking aircraft was essentially 100%. Looking back at Pearl Harbor from the perspective of the entire war, the VAL attacks represented both the apex and the beginning of the end for Japanese naval aviation. The tactical success was undeniable, the surprise was complete, the bombing accuracy unprecedented, the damage catastrophic. But strategically, it was a disaster. Admiral Yamamoto, who had planned the attack, supposedly said he feared they had awakened a sleeping giant. Whether he actually said those words or not, they proved prophetic. The American response to Pearl Harbor was not the demoralization Japan had hoped for, but rather a fierce determination for revenge. The "Remember Pearl Harbor" battle cry would drive American forces across the Pacific, island by bloody island, until they stood in Tokyo Bay. The same industrial might that had seemed dormant in 1941 roared to life, producing weapons and warriors in quantities Japan could never match. For the survivors of Pearl Harbor, the memory of the VALs would never fade. Decades later, they could still hear that distinctive screaming dive, still see those fixed landing gear and red circles growing larger as the planes plummeted toward them. Many struggled with what we now call PTSD, though it had no name then. They would wake in cold sweats, dreaming of bombs falling from a clear blue sky. Dale Garno, the Navy officer who recognized the Japanese planes that morning, would spend the rest of the war in the Pacific. He would see VALs again at Coral Sea and Midway, would watch as American fighters gradually gained superiority over them. But he never forgot that first morning, the shock of seeing enemy aircraft over American territory, the disbelief that this could actually be happening. The physical evidence of the VAL attacks can still be seen today. The USS Arizona remains where she sank, oil still seeping from her ruptured tanks, a tomb for the men who died aboard her. Bullet holes from VAL strafing runs pockmarked buildings at Hickam Field and Ford Island. These scars serve as permanent reminders of that Sunday morning when dive bombers screamed out of the sky. The technical legacy of the VAL influenced aircraft design for years after the war. The lessons learned from both using and defending against dive bombers shaped military aviation doctrine. The concept of precision bombing from steep diving attacks would evolve into modern smart weapons. In a sense, today's GPS-guided bombs are the spiritual descendants of the VAL's diving attacks, technology replacing the human pilot's skill, but achieving the same goal of putting ordnance exactly on target. But perhaps the most important legacy of the VAL at Pearl Harbor is the human one. The attack brought together Americans in a way that few events in history have matched. Regional differences, political disagreements, social divisions, all were swept away in the face of a common enemy. The sailors who died that morning, many of them barely out of their teens, became symbols of sacrifice that would inspire a nation to victory. The Japanese pilots who flew the VALs that day were also young men, many of them conflicted about attacking without a declaration of war. Some would later express regret about Pearl Harbor, especially after learning about the civilian casualties. One pilot, Zenji Abe, would eventually meet with Pearl Harbor survivors in a gesture of reconciliation, sharing tears and memories with men who had once been his enemies. The story of technological advancement is also part of the VAL's legacy. In 1941, it represented the pinnacle of dive bomber design, incorporating lessons learned from aircraft around the world. Its elliptical wings were influenced by racing planes, its dive brakes borrowed from German designs, its engine a marvel of Japanese engineering. Yet within a few years, it was hopelessly obsolete, a reminder of how quickly military technology advances during wartime. The production numbers tell their own story. Japan produced 476 D3A1s and 1016 D3A2S during the war. By contrast, the United States produced over 5,900 SBD Dauntless dive bombers alone, not counting other aircraft types. This disparity in production capacity would prove decisive. While Japan struggled to replace each lost VAL, America could afford to lose planes and pilots and still maintain numerical superiority. Training was another crucial factor. The Japanese pilots who attacked Pearl Harbor had trained for months specifically for that mission. They knew every detail of their targets, had practiced their attack runs countless times. This level of preparation was impossible to maintain as the war expanded and losses mounted. By 1944, VAL pilots were being sent into combat with minimal training, their lack of experience evident in their poor accuracy and high loss rates. The human drama of the VAL attacks extended beyond the immediate participants. Families across America learned that their sons, husbands, and fathers had died in an attack they never saw coming. The telegrams arrived days later, terse messages that shattered lives. The Navy Department deeply regrets to inform you. Each one represented a VALS bomb finding its target, a successful attack that translated into immeasurable human suffering. On the Japanese side, the VAL pilots returned to their carriers as heroes, but many were troubled by what they had done. They had achieved tactical surprise, yes, but at what cost? Some worried that they had started something that Japan could not finish. They were right. The industrial mathematics of war were inexorable. America could build ships and planes faster than Japan could sink them. The evolution of the VAL itself tells the story of Japanese desperation. The D3A2 model, introduced in 1942, had more power and range, but it was essentially the same basic design. A fixed-gear dive bomber in an age of rapidly advancing aviation technology. The Japanese knew it was obsolete, but couldn't afford to completely retool their carrier air groups in the middle of a war. They had to fight with what they had. By 1944, the situation was dire. VALs were being used for reconnaissance, anti-submarine patrol, training, anything but their intended role as precision dive bombers. The aircraft that had once been the sharp tip of the Japanese naval spear was reduced to secondary duties. When they did encounter American fighters, the results were predictable and tragic. Entire formations of VALs were shot down without scoring a single hit. The final chapter of the VAL story was written in the kamikaze campaigns of 1944 to 45. Young pilots, some with only basic training, climbed into obsolete VALs, knowing they would not return. The aircraft that had been designed for precision bombing became crude guided missiles. It was a tragic end for both machine and men, a desperate last gasp of an empire facing defeat. Yet even in these final moments, there were instances of extraordinary courage on both sides. American gunners stood at their posts, firing at incoming kamikaze VALs until the very last second. Japanese pilots flew through walls of anti-aircraft fire to reach their targets. The mutual courage and sacrifice, though on opposite sides of a terrible war, formed a strange bond between enemies. Today, only one restored VAL exists in the world, at the Plains of Fame Museum in California. Two more unrestored examples sit in museums, silent testimony to a vanished era. The rest were scrapped, abandoned, or lost in combat. The physical remnants are few, but the memory remains powerful. Every December 7th, Survivors gather at Pearl Harbor to remember, their numbers dwindling with each passing year. The technical specifications of the VAL seem almost quaint by modern standards. Its top speed of 240 to 270 mph would barely keep up with modern civilian aircraft. Its bomb load of 550 pounds is less than a single modern smart bomb. Its range of 915 miles would be considered limited even for a small civilian plane. Yet with these modest capabilities, it changed the course of history. The legacy of Pearl Harbor and the Val dive bombers extends far beyond military history. The attack fundamentally changed America's relationship with the world. The isolationism that had characterized American foreign policy evaporated in the smoke rising from Battleship Row. The nation that emerged from World War II was transformed, ready to take on global responsibilities that continue to this day. The Val attacks also changed how America thinks about national security. The surprise attack paradigm established at Pearl Harbor would echo through the Cold War and into the 21st century. The phrase, "another Pearl Harbor," became shorthand for any surprise attack on American soil, invoked after 9/11 and in discussions of cyber warfare and other modern threats. But perhaps the most enduring legacy is the human one. The attack brought out both the worst and best in humanity, the worst in the surprise attack that killed thousands, the best in the heroism of those who fought back and those who saved lives amid the chaos. Stories emerged of sailors diving into oil-covered, burning water to rescue shipmates, of nurses working for days without sleep to save the wounded, of ordinary people performing extraordinary acts of courage. The Val dive bomber was the instrument of this tragedy and triumph, a machine that for a few hours on a Sunday morning held the fate of nations in its bomb bay. The pilots who flew them and the sailors who faced them were caught up in forces beyond their control. Yet their individual actions, their choices to fight, to save, to sacrifice, define the moment and its meaning. As we look back across the decades, the Val at Pearl Harbor represents a confluence of technology, strategy, and human drama that changed everything. It was simultaneously an ending and a beginning. The end of American innocence about its geographic isolation, the beginning of America as a global superpower. The end of the battleship era, the beginning of carrier aviation's dominance. The end of peace, the beginning of a war that would reshape the world. The men who survived that morning would carry its memory for the rest of their lives. Some would suffer nightmares for decades. Others would channel their experiences into ensuring such an attack could never happen again. All would remember the sound, that distinctive screaming dive that announced death falling from a clear sky. The Val's wail became the soundtrack to the day that would live in infamy. In the broader sweep of history, the Val was just one weapon among many, used for less than 4 years in a war that saw rapid technological change. But at Pearl Harbor, for those 2 hours on December 7th, 1941, it was the instrument that changed everything. The obsolete dive bomber with fixed landing gear, flown by elite pilots trained to perfection, achieved something that all the modern technology in the world hasn't been able to replicate: complete strategic surprise against a major power. The emotional impact ripples through time. Veterans of Pearl Harbor spent decades coming to terms with that morning. Some found peace through reconciliation with former enemies. Others carried their anger to the grave. All were marked by the experience of facing death from the sky, delivered with precision by an enemy they hadn't known was coming. The story ends where it began, with human beings caught in the machinery of war. The Japanese pilot peering through his bomb sight at the Arizona below, knowing his bomb would kill hundreds. The American sailor looking up to see death diving toward him at 280 miles per hour. The nurse rushing toward the flames to pull wounded men to safety. The mechanic trying desperately to get fighters airborne to fight back. Each playing their part in a drama none had chosen, but all would remember. The Aichi D3A Val dive bomber was, in the end, just aluminum and steel, engine and wings. But in the hands of determined men on that December morning, it became the pen that wrote one of history's most dramatic chapters. The shock waves from its bombs rippled outward. eventually reaching Tokyo and Berlin, changing the fate of millions who would never see a Val or hear its distinctive scream. That scream echoes still in the minds of the last survivors, a sound that takes them back instantly to that morning when the world changed. They were young then, full of life and plans for the future. The Vals took that future and replaced it with something else. Trauma for some, purpose for others, but transformation for all. They had witnessed history pivoting on a single moment, delivered at the point of a bomb falling from a diving aircraft with fixed landing gear and a rising sun on its wings. And so the story of the Val at Pearl Harbor becomes not just military history, but human history. A reminder that the great events that shape our world ultimately come down to individual human beings making choices, taking actions, facing consequences. The Japanese pilot who chose to volunteer for the mission, the American sailor who chose to stay at his gun, the nurse who chose to run toward danger, the commander who chose to ignore the warnings. Each choice mattered. Each action had consequences that rippled outward in ways no one could have foreseen. The last survivors of that morning are nearly gone now, their voices fading into history. But their story, the story of the day the Vals came screaming down from the Hawaiian sky, remains as powerful and relevant as ever. It reminds us that peace is fragile, that surprise is always possible, and that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things when history demands it. The Val may be obsolete, Pearl Harbor may be a memorial rather than an active base, but the lessons of that morning remain as sharp and clear as the sound of a dive bomber plummeting toward its target. Forever frozen in time, forever a warning, forever a testament to the courage of those who faced death from above and fought back with everything they had.